won't you spare me over till another year?
Before I started playing Until Dawn, it was pitched to me as like Heavy Rain, but not terrible, which, as pitches go, is pretty perfectly suited to my tastes. I always thought that I could really love Heavy Rain, if only I didn't hate it so goddamn much. If Quantic Dream's little thriller wannabe were written and performed by people who actually spoke English, or if it had learned any lessons at all on pacing and plot structure from the movies it aspired to emulate, it could have been something really special. Not special like Beyond Two Souls in that, aw, bless its heart for trying kind of way, but genuinely moving and thrilling and even funny on purpose. Until Dawn is all of those things, at least some of the time. It doesn't always work, but when it does, it really works. To explore why, I'm gonna need to spoil a lot of Until Dawn's story. If you're just here to find out whether you should play the game or not, I'm giving it a silver medal, so if you've got a PS4, I'd say yes, definitely, absolutely. With that out of the way, let's get on with this. On a superficial level, Supermassive Games, who've come a long way from making Little Big Planet DLC and shitty Doctor Who games, have succeeded where Quantic Dream has failed time and again. They have captured the essence of a film genre, in this case horror, and made it interactive, allowing the player to determine who lives and dies and screws irresponsibly in the interim through their actions. But in doing so, they've also managed to craft a fascinating meta-puzzle based on cause and effect. At its core, Until Dawn isn't just about making choices and seeing how they play out. Unlike the works of Quantic Dream, this game has an explicit win condition, getting all the teams out alive. To achieve that without a strategy guide requires that you play through the game multiple times and understand the complex chain of minor events that leads to each possible conclusion. In this, Until Dawn has less in common with Heavy Rain than it does with a modern classic from a different offshoot of the adventure genre, the DS visual novel Escape the Room hybrid 999, 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors. Which I would give a platinum medal if I were reviewing it, so definitely play that if you have the time. Just don't play it on iOS, because that version sucks. Both games are rooted in tried-and-true horror setups. In Until Dawn, a bunch of stupid teenagers go to a remote cabin in the woods for a weekend to party and have sex at the same place where 2 of their friends died the previous year, so of course they end up being stalked by a knife-wielding maniac. In 999, a bunch of strangers wake up in a rusty Saw-style death trap and are told they have to play a game if they want to escape and survive. In both cases, the prospect of experiencing Friday the 13th or Saw firsthand is intriguing and unique enough to keep you going for a few hours, but just as the standard genre tropes start to wear thin, things take a turn for the weird. In Until Dawn, supernatural elements start coming into play, first in the form of strange, future-predicting totems, and later in the form of huge, scary monsters, while the psycho killer plot is revealed to be a red herring. In 999, the characters start dabbling in pseudoscience and raising really interesting philosophical quandaries about the nature of consciousness while trying to escape from the death traps, which, trust me, is enough to keep you hooked through at least a few different endings. But I'm not reviewing 999, so I won't obsess over it. No matter how much I want to. Seriously, guys, you need to play it. You need to. While Until Dawn is busy raising the stakes of its plot, it also spends a good deal of time fleshing out its characters, which is important because at the start you're gonna hate pretty much all of them. Part of it is that the 18s fall into pretty stereotypical horror movie roles. There's Matt, the dumb jock, Emily, the stone-cold honor-roll bitch, arrogant popular boy Mike, airheaded party girl Jessica, and insensitive douchebag rich boy Josh, Chris, the nerd/class clown, Ashley, the timid geek, and Sam, the one who's definitely gonna live until the last scene, are more immediately likable, but in very horror movie stereotypical ways. Beyond that, most of them are introduced doing some straight-up awful stuff. In the events of the prologue, set a year prior to the main game, everyone but Chris, Josh, and Sam plays a cruel prank on Josh's sister Hannah, who runs off in tears and falls off a cliff shortly thereafter alongside her twin, Beth. Yeah, in the first 15 minutes of this game, these kids basically kill one of their best friends, and out of all of them, only Ashley shows more than a hint of remorse for it. But that's only what you get from a surface reading, though the writing is intentionally occasionally campy, these characters actually have a surprising amount of depth to them. As the writer says in one of the game's unlockable production featurettes, these are teenagers questioning their own identity and intentionally filling movie archetypes as a way of coping with a stressful situation. And their reluctance to confront what they did to their friend comes less out of a lack of guilt and more out of just not knowing how. Admittedly, that does come across as a bit of an excuse to have a cliched plot, but having a reason is better than having none at all, and it is actually reflected in the gameplay, kind of. As you make decisions for each character, bars representing traits like charitable, honest, funny, or romantic fill and empty out, indicating that how they see themselves is somewhat malleable. Their starting stats are always visible, showing a distinct gap between who they want to be and who they turn out to be under pressure. This contrast allows almost every character to make a surprising turn, such as Mike's decisiveness and courage when Jessica is taken early on, that makes them far more likable than they first seem. Except Emily. What the trait system doesn't do, fundamentally, is change anything. The game's story logic is based on event flags, not percentile chances, so stats won't have a tangible effect on any outcomes in the first place. It's just window dressing, or if you want to be charitable, a metaphor. The same applies to the relationship meters that fill and empty based on your choices. Characters will act more harshly toward one another when these bars are low, but only because of hooks in dialogue that call back to specific choices that you've made. Ashley won't decide to hold the door open or slam it shut on Chris in the last chapter by weighing the value of their relationship bar. It's entirely based on whether he chooses to shoot himself or her when the supposed maniac has them hostage. The trait and relationship trackers do serve a purpose in the game's design, though. They don't tell the game what to do, but they do help the player keep track of what's going on, as does the butterfly effect log, which tracks the knock-on results of all your choices. That, in turn, makes it easier to understand how their choices are affecting the game's causality. And that, when you get down to it, is the meat of Until Dawn's gameplay. None of its choices are meant to be particularly harrowing moral conundrums. They're steps toward a goal. Most questions have objectively right and wrong answers, though which is which depends on what ending you want to see. Figuring out what goal they'll lead to is what makes them interesting. Take, for example, the aforementioned scene with Chris and Ashley and the handgun. Taken at face value, it's a potentially tense choice of which character you want to live or die. In reality, it's a small logic puzzle or story comprehension test. If you pay a decent amount of attention to the plot and make sure to pick up clues scattered throughout the world, you'll probably have some inkling by that point that the maniac is really Josh playing a twisted revenge prank, and there's no real danger. Knowing that, shooting Ashley is clearly the wrong choice, an implicit failure state. There are two things Until Dawn needs to make this work. Firstly, there needs to be a degree of failure and success. If Until Dawn was rendered unwinnable by a single choice, that would suck, but even if your actions caused Chris to die, you can still make it to the game's ending. Your win is just suboptimal. Secondly, the correct choice needs to be logically telegraphed. It's not fun to just take a shot in the dark and hope something good comes of it. You need to have a reasonable expectation of getting it right the first time. Until Dawn sticks to horror movie logic as much as it can, which helps with a lot of decision making. Don't do anything obviously stupid like go off on your own, and conversely don't leave any other characters alone for too long, and you'll probably make it through in one piece, save for some particularly tricky bits. For those, you'll want to pick up as many of the optional clues and totem poles as possible. You might be tempted to simply dismiss them out of hand as meaningless collectibles in the vein of Uncharted's treasures, but they're key in unraveling the game's story. What I like about these clues is that they're all treated as pieces of a puzzle. A box of fake newspapers won't tell you much about the maniac on its own, but coupled with Josh's psych evaluation and some fake answering machine recordings, the truth of the matter becomes clear. Likewise, the more remnants you find of the man with the flamethrower from the opening, and the more you learn about the history of the mountain, the easier it becomes to suss out that there's a deeper threat waiting on the mountain. These clues only work contextually. It's not like there's a clue bar that triggers different cutscenes depending on how many you have. The characters will figure things out based on what specific information they've found, and even fill in gaps if they have enough to go on elsewhere. It all feels very organic. Well, almost all of it. The exceptions are the sisters' clues that tell you more about the twins who died the previous year. If you find all of them, Josh will recognize his sister Hannah as the Wendigo at the end of the game, but if you don't, he just immediately gets killed. In a story that mostly relies on logic, this feels pretty out of place. I can see how knowing about Hannah's butterfly tattoo and finding out what happened to her in the cave would contribute to Josh recognizing her, but why would it be reliant on finding film trophies and photos that are already in Josh's house? And for that matter, why would any of that contribute to Hannah recognizing Josh? Does she smell all of her old stuff in Sam and Mike's pockets? I thought Wendigos lost all traces of their humanity. And when he's discovered by the Rangers a few days later, why is Josh already mostly turned into a Wendigo when the transformation of the miners in 1952 took over a month? It might sound like I'm nitpicking. Okay, I am nitpicking, but it's a really weak point in otherwise strong narrative design, and it muddles the game's lore. It feels overly video gamey, basically. Another thing that feels a little gamey is the set of collectible totems that show brief snatches of possible future events, like the consequences of certain choices or places where characters can die, but these at least can be explained by the game's supernatural elements. And they cut a careful balance of showing just enough of what could happen to heighten the stakes of certain scenes without losing the tension. None of the clips give away all that much until you're right at the point where they matter, so they leave you wondering when you'll be in danger, and when you do recognize something, they evoke a gut reaction of, "Oh shit, I could die here!" And the totems that don't depict gruesome deaths instead serve to clue you into otherwise unpredictable choices. See, there are some choices with broad ramifications that the game doesn't fully explain until toward the end. For instance, shooting a squirrel or scaring a bird with a snowball can lead to those animals putting you in danger much later on. That might seem arbitrary and unpredictable at first, but late in the game you learn that the spirit of the mountain frowns on humans throwing off the balance of nature, and it starts to make sense. And before each of these you can find a totem that will warn you what not to do. More obtuse moments like these make the causality puzzle more interesting and give the game replay value. Fortunately, none of them leads to an otherwise unpreventable death, they mostly just hurt characters' relationships. The totems and the way these choices are written allow the game to be unpredictable, kind of important when it's trying to scare you, without feeling unfair. Until Dawn doesn't always strike that perfect balance, but it errs on the side of making things feel fairer to the player. Still, that comes at the cost of undercutting some of the horror. It doesn't take many clues at all to figure out that Josh is the maniac. In fact, if you've seen any movie with a twist before, you'll probably guess even if you don't find any. It doesn't take eagle vision to see that his lower body isn't moving at all in this scene, for example, and the fact that he's the only teen you don't control directly is kind of a huge giveaway. That ends up diffusing a lot of the tension in the sections where you're being chased by the supposed maniac. I mean, slashers aren't particularly scary at the best of times, get a hold of an edged weapon and your playing field is instantly leveled, but knowing that the slasher is just Josh removes any sense of threat that he might have posed. It doesn't help that the developers use a lot of jump scares in the early games, supposedly placed and timed after rigorous testing to get the maximum possible response from players. The game also basically never turns the lights on in order to heighten the atmosphere. A jump scare might get your heart racing, but that's just because it surprises you. The human brain is wired to flinch at sudden movement and loud microtransactions. Boogity, boogity, boogity. That's not the same as being scared. It's especially egregious when there's no proper justification for most of the scares. A few just boil down to the kids jumping out at each other because they think it's funny, and most of the rest are just animals popping up at inopportune, sometimes inexplicable moments. Seriously, did the Wolverine crawl under the sink and close the cupboard behind itself? How does that even work? Likewise, turning all the lights off in a house for no reason doesn't really make it scary either. Atmospheric horror works by injecting uncanny elements into a relatable setting, and there's nothing particularly relatable about a mountain lodge with working power filled with characters who refuse to turn on the lights because reasons. These sections are still interesting and funny, and the character interactions are more than entertaining enough to keep you playing, they're just not really scary at all. Again, I'm not harping on this because I dislike the game, far from it. Once the Wendigos start coming out of the woodwork, it does become genuinely terrifying, but that's the root of my complaint. Supermassive clearly knows how to do this stuff right, so it's extra disappointing to see them get it wrong. I feel the need to stress that most of the game is still plenty scary. When Emily and Matt or Jess and Mike are braving the wilderness, or when the characters have to venture into derelict mines or an abandoned sanatorium filled with monsters, it works really well. The design of the Wendigos is impeccable. Supermassive hasn't crafted a wholly original breed of monster here, but they've incorporated all the right elements from zombie, vampire, and werewolf fiction into one bone-chilling beast. The way they move and sound is also impressively believable and unnerving. Their bestial screams sound just human enough to send a shiver straight down your spine, and the way they crawl up walls at light speed is terrifying. Until Dawn's motion capture and animation is great across the board, but the team that made these gangly monstrosities come to life absolutely nailed it. Even the jump scares work in these sections, because there are real threats to worry about, and because the game gets a lot more creative in how they're implemented. Wendigos start to pop up when you're in the middle of making choices, or when you turn the camera to look at something else. Their shadows dart across the screen or zip through the periphery as you're moving around. The jump scares become subtle and smart and end up being implemented into the narrative instead of just being thrown in where the focus testing says they'll work. The best one comes right at the end of the game and plays into one of the most novel mechanics mechanics. We'll get back to that in a minute. Until Dawn's action is driven entirely by QuickTime events, and it doesn't really do anything different from any of the other QTE-based adventure games out there, but they are well implemented. Every input makes sense contextually, unlike, say, the Simon sequences in Indigo Prophecy, and the button cues are clear and obvious. They work to get you feeling panicked without requiring that you memorize them, which is good because you can't replay them. If you fail some of them, your character will die, and that's it. But Until Dawn also makes use of the PS4 controller's move support for what I can only call anti-QTEs. In order to stay hidden at certain points, you need to hold the controller perfectly still, with nothing to do but watch as monsters and maniacs alike get way too close for comfort. These become especially vital when the Wendigos show up, since they have T-Rex-style movement-based vision. Many of Until Dawn's best moments are spent simply waiting, frozen, for the monster in front of you to move on. In the final encounter with the Wendigos, you have to sit through 4 of these while the monsters stalk around the main hall of the lodge, baring their gnarled teeth and loosing unholy shrieks right up in your face. Every muscle tenses in anticipation of the jump scares, because you know if you so much as flinch, Sam or Mike, the 2 most likable characters by a wide margin, will die. What a fucking climax to a horror game. If David Cage had made this, you'd be punching Wendigos left and right, flying around the lodge doing weird kung fu shit. But under Supermassive, you get a perfect mix of build, tension, and satisfying release, all built around this ingenious mechanic that forces you to immerse yourself in the scares. The don't move mechanic is one of those ideas that makes me wonder why nobody's thought of it before, but the answer to that is kind of obvious. To work to their fullest, the don't move segments need to put you face to face with the monsters and characters, and until this generation, that's been a really, really bad idea. Games like Dead Space look realistic enough to make you cringe when a CG needle hits a CG eyeball, but they can't create a sustained sense of dread when their monsters are on screen, and their characters can't really sell any believable emotions. The most successful horror titles these days are things like Amnesia, in which actually looking at the monster means near certain death. But Until Dawn doesn't have to hide its monsters or its actors, because it looks incredible. Out of all the games aiming for realism these days, it's not much of a stretch to call it the reigning champion, even if open-world games like The Witcher and MGS5 are more technically impressive. Its only real competitors for sheer fidelity are Battlefront and the Boredom 1886. Of course, the Wendigos benefit greatly from this high-fidelity rendering. Their stretched, leathery skin and bony forms give the impression that transforming into one must be extremely painful, though not nearly as painful as what they can do to you with their jagged teeth and claws. Until Dawn's environments look so real you could touch them. Its characters are well on their way up the far slope of the uncanny valley, and in a horror game, any unnerving sensation they might create can be a positive. Thanks to high-quality performance capture, their expressions run a full spectrum of emotion, so it's easy to empathize with them when the game holds focus on their terrified faces. Speaking of characters, there are 2 aside from the teens that each serve an important role in the story. The first you'll encounter is Jack, called the Stranger in-game, a mysterious man with a flamethrower who seems to be hunting the kids but is in fact trying to contain the mountain's Wendigo problem. His main purpose is to legitimize the psycho threat and obscure the fact that Josh is the one terrorizing his friends. After all, how could Josh be the psycho when a man with a machete showed up a year ago? In that respect, he kind of fails. It's obvious too early on that there are 2 different potential killers on the mountain, and Josh's modus operandi is totally different from his. Where he succeeds, though, is in establishing the Wendigos as a credible threat. When he first appears, the kids are terrified of him, and when he finally reveals his true intentions, he seems like a total badass, and for all that build-up, the Wendigos kill him after just a momentary slip-up. This is a great way of raising the stakes and shifting the story's focus without making the earlier developments feel wasted. Jumping subgenres like Until Dawn does isn't easy, but it works thanks to clever writing tricks like this. Less clever is the game's use of the psychiatrist who shows up between levels, Dr. Hill. He serves a similar purpose to Dr. Kaufman of Silent Hill Shattered Memories, evaluating the player psychologically and judging their actions, but his implementation simply doesn't compare. His questions telegraph what their results will be from a mile away. The way his office decays with each visit is a lot more effective than anything he says, even though Peter Stormare's performance in the role is award-worthy.
Do you share this fear?
Hill does offer some insight into Josh's battered psyche, since the version of him we see in-game is a paranoid delusion. The threat of a therapist turning your fears and insecurities against you is certainly potent, but I feel like Dr. Hill needs to be more subtle about it in order to affect me the way he was apparently affecting Josh. With that said, the payoff with Josh's delusions in the last few chapters is pretty effective, especially when you finally get to play with him and his dead sisters start coming after him. I just wish Dr. Hill worked better on his own. I also wish that the rest of the characters got more more closure than they do at the end. Once they make it off the mountain, they end up in a police station saying canned lines to an interviewer. These lines are perfectly serviceable at reflecting your choices, but they don't really feel like much of a reward for saving everyone. What I like about these characters is how they interact with one another, and it's a shame that they don't say one word to each other after the final encounter. Obviously, making a ton of variant cutscenes for each potential set of survivors would be prohibitively expensive, but the way the epilogue is executed feels very impersonal. Still, when all is said and done, the game nails what it sets out to do, that is, make an interactive slasher flick, and a weak ending can't undo that. Those are my thoughts on Until Dawn, but as always, I'd love to hear yours, so please leave a comment below, and like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. On the next one, we're going to be analyzing the cinematic elements of Life is Strange, and in the meanwhile, we've got tons of other great content on the channel for you to check out. If you enjoy what I do, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter for regular updates, and if you want to know more games that I think you should play, you should check out my Steam Curator page, link in the doobly-doo. As always, Jesus H. Christ, Ma! Can it wait 2 goddamn minutes? I'm Kenny! Master of Horror right here. Bear pun!